Hello and welcome to our special program, a live TV marathon in support for Ukraine from Berlin studio. It is a special event we have prepared by the European Resilience Initiative Center and the Silicon Curtain video podcast with Jonathan. Thank you. We'll see him today too. And this will be an 8-hour event today with 5 stellar panels and a lot of interviews, which we have recorded extra for this show. And this event marks the 3rd year of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine and 11th year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll have a lot of panels today. As I said, you can have a look into a time schedule in the description of this video. And the first panel is dedicated to the question, is the West's support to Ukraine is more words or deed? What is going with the West's support? I'm happy to welcome our first guest here, Burnett. He is a security expert and analyst. He's a journalist, a Canadian working in Berlin. He's also a co-host of Berlin Side Out, a podcast which he runs together with Dr. Benjamin Tallis from DGAP, a German Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Aaron.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Sergey.
So look, we have a lot of events which happened this week, and in particular, another voting in Bundestag, no Taurus for Ukraine.
Yeah.
We have a speech or explanation of Federal Chancellor Scholz why it is not possible to send Taurus, and we had also President Joe Biden's address to the nation. We will address this topic later. And President Macron has developed his taste for being hawkish. So a lot of things.
Right.
So what is going on in the world? Do we finally found some deeds, or is it still the words?
Well, I think that's the big question at the moment. I mean, I think we finally see a French president who is interested in, as you say, more deeds as opposed to words, and to back up words with action. Of course, we could criticize the French president as well for words versus deeds, as the case may be. French support for Ukraine is really dwarfed by German support and by U.S. support in absolute terms, of course. So it will be interesting to see if Macron's really hawkish rhetoric, especially yesterday with that speech, is really matched up by action. But I think that obviously reflects a real impatience, particularly with Berlin, and also I think with Washington as well, that despite the amount of support that's been given by both Berlin and Washington to Ukraine, that we have leaders in those two capitals that really just don't get the strategic moment that we're in and don't get the scale of what is necessary. So it's very fine for Germany, for example, to say, as it often does, that it is the second largest supporter of Ukraine in terms of military aid, in terms of finances, in terms of in absolute terms, but there are very key things that are missing that Chancellor Olaf Scholz refuses to deliver. The biggest example, of course, of that is Taurus, which is the long-range cruise missile system that would actually allow Ukraine to hit certain very strategic targets, like the Kerch Bridge, for example, that connects Crimea with Russia at the moment, an illegally constructed bridge, of course, and would actually allow the Ukrainians to hit the supply lines of Russia.
Look, that is what I wanted to focus on. We have seen last year or end 22, early 23, a lot of international pressure on Chancellor Scholz.
Yes.
The Poles were very hawkish. They said, we will deliver Leopards 2 to Ukraine with or without German permission. The French said, we deliver tanks like wheeled tanks. The Brits said, we will deliver Challenger tanks.
Yes.
And then Scholz said, okay, like if you all deliver, I just join you.
Yes.
Do we have the same situation now? Can we say that the international pressure on Scholz has reached the level when he will say, okay, like I don't have room for retreat, I need to act because I'm forced to?
I think what really would make a difference maybe in this debate, or whether Chancellor Scholz actually decides to send Taurus, is whether the U.S. would send ATACMS. these missiles. So we saw that was very much what happened with the whole Leopard tank debate. Chancellor Scholz wouldn't, he moved, I think, on Leopards for a number of different reasons. He moved, I think, because there was parliamentary pressure to do so. It took months, of course, and that's months that were wasted that could have had a difference on the battlefield in Ukraine, for example. We always have to remember this, that every day that there's a delay is a delay that the Ukrainians don't have the things that they need to have to be able to actually make gains, to actually push towards victory, and ultimately that costs lives, clearly. On this debate, I think, for Taurus, I think we have just about every possible source of pressure that you can have at the moment. It is a discussion, obviously, in German public debate, on talk shows, that sort of thing. We have parliamentary pressure. That's very clear from the not simply from the opposition, from the Christian Democrats, but also from even within the coalition, certain members of the Greens and the Free Democrats. Although I would argue that some of those parliamentarians could actually up that pressure quite a bit. But one place that we're not seeing that, we do see that pressure from Macron, obviously, who has felt the need to rebuke Olaf Scholz in public. We should note that that's very significant, because usually these kinds of rebukes would come from behind closed doors, diplomatically. You know, you'd shut the door and Macron might say to Scholz, "What are you doing? Like, why aren't you moving on this?" And now Macron is clearly so frustrated that he's rebuking Scholz in public to up the pressure as high as possible. Where we're not seeing pressure on Scholz that has worked before yet is from Washington, and I think that's one of the big questions.
That is what I wanted to dig a bit deeper in. We have seen, since October last year, we have seen 3 attempts by the oppositional party, Christian Democratic Union, to vote, to push the deputies of the ruling parties of three parties coalition, the Greens, Liberals, and Social Democrats, to vote, which is a non-binding vote. It's just like making a moral call for Scholz to deliver Taurus. And all these votes failed. The last failed like yesterday, this week. And you have been, I remember we recorded an interview with you after you have returned from the Munich Security Conference in February. And you said that behind the closed doors, there was some movement and there was some readiness to rethink and at least to discuss something, and maybe to find a solution. And now we see that the fronts in the Chancellor's office are really consolidated, and they say no means no. So what has happened, and can Scholz face some sort of, I don't know, like some removal from his office?
I mean, that is the big question at the moment, whether we could ever see a no-confidence vote in Chancellor Scholz. Of course, we should note that under German constitutional order, this is quite difficult. It's in my home country, in Canada, or in the UK, for example, that's actually a lot easier to hold a no-confidence vote in the Prime Minister, in the government, this sort of thing. For that to be done here in Germany is more difficult, because you have to simultaneously designate a successor if you hold a no-confidence vote in the Chancellor. You can't simply hold that vote and not know who the next person is going to be. You need to know that right at the time. But I think that there is the Chancellor's office has always had a united front in this no, and the question is what his coalition partners are actually willing to do to be able to force his hand here. And ultimately, unless pressure comes from outside, from Washington, as I just said before, I think that we're at a moment, perhaps in German politics, where the only way to really potentially put pressure on the Chancellor's office is to start talking about no confidence. I don't know that we're necessarily going to see that. I think that we know that the Chancellor's office has put pressure on the other 2 parties in the government, the Greens and the Liberal Free Democrats, to basically say, if you vote against us in these Taurus motions, you are jeopardizing the coalition. And I think that makes these parties nervous, because German politics is, it's a political system that prizes stability. And no one wants to be seen as the one that's going to blow up the coalition. However, I think that we have to remember that there has been a successful vote of no confidence in Germany before. That happened in 1982. Interestingly enough, it was over the issue of missiles, American missiles in Germany. And so I don't know if we'll see history repeat itself, but ultimately, the other parties might worry that holding this no confidence vote based on a foreign policy issue like Taurus, which is not something that you typically win German elections with, is going to see them punished in the polls. I'm not sure that's the case. This is a historically unpopular coalition. 46% of Germans, according to a poll in January, say that they are very dissatisfied with the government. Not simply like somewhat dissatisfied, that's another 34%. So we only have 18% of Germans who actually say that they are satisfied with the work of this coalition. So I'm not sure that anyone who does decide to start talking no confidence is going to be punished nearly as much as they think. And we also have to remember that at the end of the day, as my friend and co-host Ben Tallis likes to say, I'm going to quote him here. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today, at the last minute, but I want to bring him in right now. National security is the irreducible function of the state. That's something that he says all the time. That's a view that I share. And ultimately, if your state cannot guarantee your own security, and let's be clear that Ukraine not winning this war against Russia would be a direct threat to our security in Germany and in Europe, then that's your most basic function. You have to act on that. You have a responsibility, whatever the political consequences are, in my view.
That is what I regularly note when we have the donations campaigns for the Ukrainian army, for support of the Ukrainian army. And by the way, you have a link for the donation for the Ukrainian army in the description to this video. You can also scan this QR code and go to the link which you see currently on your screen, and you can donate your money as viewers of this TV marathon for the needs of the Ukrainian army. And we witness how actively the Germans and other people in the West, France, UK, Canada, your country, United States, how actively people donate. And when we receive these donations, which we then transform into support for the Ukrainian army, I pretty often read the comments which people leave together with the payment and say, I'm so sorry that my leadership doesn't do what they need to do. That's my part, and I'm so sorry I cannot donate more. And I'm always shocked because, look, you have donated your money you have earned for the needs of another country, and you ask for forgiveness for what? You have done a good thing. And we see in Germany, over 60% of people want more military support for Ukraine.
Yes.
And not like over 50% for Taurus, but this can be seen also as a result of a lot of debates, and people really have fear.
Yes.
But this chancellor is definitely less hawkish and less supportive for Ukraine than the German population. What happened to the Zeitenwende?
What happened to the Zeitenwende? Well, if you ask me that question with regard to the Chancellery, I would say that Zeitenwende has petered out, and they are returning to old habits, which got us into this mess before. I'm not willing to write the Zeitenwende off elsewhere just yet, though, I would say. So one example that we have seen, as you say, is the German public. The German public has had quite a significant change, regardless of these polls that we're seeing on Taurus, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in January 2022, we saw a poll that showed that 75% of Germans, a full 3/4, were against delivering any weapons whatsoever to help Ukraine defend itself. Around the time that the Leopard 2 tanks were sent, we saw that increase to over 55% to eventually 60 or so percent or even more in favor. We also see that the German population, about 3/4 of it, in some polls have said that they are willing to deal with the rising cost of living in order to help support Ukraine, that is a cost that they are willing to bear. So I think that we have seen a significant Zeitenwende amongst the German public. whatever the current polls around Taurus say, which shows that there is a lot of fear, I think that really we have to remember that foreign policy decisions, especially, and discourse in Germany is very elite-driven. It's very much driven by the top. And despite the fact that Olaf Scholz is a historically unpopular chancellor, Germans do place a lot of respect in that office, and they place a lot of trust in whoever holds it, regardless of whether or not I think that Olaf Scholz has acted to be able to earn that trust. And they do pay attention to the arguments that the Chancellor is making. And his argument is that if we deliver Taurus, it will make us a party to the war, that it's a certain red line, it invites a certain amount of retaliation that previous actions and shipments of weapons have not invited. This is, of course, ridiculous. There's no evidence to suggest that that's true, but that is filtering into the debate, and I think that it's clouding a lot of things at the moment, unfortunately.
We are facing now, like Germany is entering practically the election mode. We have June this year, elections to the European Parliament.
Yes.
We have next year in September, elections to the German Bundestag.
Yes.
Actually, it's funny because the Bundestag doesn't have as much power in Germany as the European Parliament, which can dictate or decide, not dictate, decide, of course, on economy, life, and standards, and a lot of things besides, except of the foreign policy and security policy. It's all the competency mostly of the European Union, but the Germans love the Bundestag. And they think that the Bundestag elections are important. So this year, end of this year, we will enter the Bundestag election campaign. And the Social Democrats seem to have entered a mode we need to find what is our main message. And our main message will be we are a party of peace. We have seen these debates in the Bundestag that we are for peace, we want to freeze the conflict. As they call it, not win the war in Ukraine, but Mr. Mützenich said we want to freeze the conflict.
Yes.
And what is going on? They're coming back to their old habits, do they?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they necessarily think that they're doing. I think that perhaps we are seeing a social democratic party in Germany that's getting a little bit desperate. I mean, it is historically unpopular. We see that they aren't even in second place in the polls. I mean, recent polls have them on something like 15% or that sort of thing. The Greens are right behind them on that. The opposition Christian Democrats are on 30%, so more than double the Social Democrat total. The opposition Christian Democrats, if an election were held tomorrow, might get as many as votes as the three currently ruling parties put together. That's quite that's quite something. And we may be seeing an SPD that thinks, well, this worked for us before, maybe it will again, maybe the easy solution of freezing the conflict will bring us back to the possibility of sort of our economic and trade model as it was before, and we can lower cost of living and we can be this party of peace and all of that. All of this, of course, is ridiculous to anyone who looks at the way that Putin behaves at all. I mean, right on the very same day as Mr. Mützenich made that speech in the German Bundestag saying, accusing allies of using the war for their own interests, whatever that means. And I find that rather rich coming from the same party that championed Nord Stream 2 for all of these years in the middle of an active war in Ukraine and in the East since 2014, of course. But I mean, it was really just an absolute gobsmacking thing to hear him say. I'm still sort of processing it myself, but on the very same day that he gave that speech, we saw Dmitry Medvedev release his demands for what negotiation should look like. And the Russian demands are basically, complete annexation of all of Ukraine, saying that Ukraine must be denazified, saying that the UN should basically bless essentially a total, complete Russian takeover of Ukraine, that the current Ukrainian government, democratically elected government, should be liquidated. How do you negotiate with a Russian regime that says this?
And then you have like the discussion, will the delivery of like 20 or 50 or 100 Taurus missiles be a red line for Russia, and then we'll start something terrible? They already announced they want to start it as long as we allow that. We have seen in Germany last month this debate, will Russia be ready to attack Germany and NATO? And it seemed to be like some sort of a change, like a slight change. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, nobody would seriously have a German political discussion or a talk show or an article in a serious magazine or a newspaper discussing the very topic.
Yes.
Russia attacking NATO. Now it seems to be a topic which is absolutely normal and standard. So do we see some sort of decoupling of those who know the situation on the ground and those who really are empowered to take decisions?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, Germany is a country that for years has been surrounded by all of its friends. I mean, think about it. It's 8 of Germany's neighbors are in the European Union. The 9th is and NATO. The 9th is Switzerland, of course. So we have had an entire generation where we are just used to safety and security, and we have an elite that is used to safety and security, and I think probably is suffering from a certain amount of complacency that the situation can, is always going to stay that way. The reality is that on the ground, and certainly to anyone who watches Putin, weakness in and of itself is escalatory. We have certain theories that have sounded good for years in German public debate about trying to avoid escalation. Putin doesn't respect that. I mean, it sounds all nice in an academic sense in Germany, but it does not correspond to the reality of the ground. I mean, right now, Scholz simply says, I will not deliver Taurus, that's a red line for me. Putin says, oh, great, I've got this wonderful shipment of Iranian cruise missiles that's coming into me. I mean, like, he doesn't care. He doesn't care about our red lines.
Well, he cares, but quite an opposite way. He's happy that we demonstrate our weakness.
Yeah, we've told him that he can just do what he wants, and he's going to bring in his own cruise missiles, partly because we will not deliver our own. I mean, weakness is escalatory. So I find that rather interesting that Olaf Scholz says he's trying to prevent escalation by not delivering Taurus, but being weak on the topic is inviting the exact same escalation that he is hoping to prevent. So, and let's be clear, if Ukraine falls, we suddenly have a much more tense situation in Europe, where I think that we could see Putin basically say, let's try for Lithuania, let's try for Estonia. Why not? I mean, they let us do Ukraine, so why not? This is the way he thinks. And although we might not see, for example, in a scenario like that, ground troops that would come directly into Germany, I do think that we can't rule out the possibility of, in a situation like that Putin might lob a couple of cruise missiles at us, at Cologne or at Berlin or Munich, basically as a way to scare us.
Absolutely,
right?
And we know that Article 5 NATO doesn't start automatically. It's not the case. And the missile hits a territory of a country, then all countries automatically send their armies to protect. No, your government needs to ask for that, and then other countries need to decide how much they can help, what is possible. So it can be possible if Scholz is or his ministers are afraid of escalation. They'll say, okay, like one missile is bad enough. We don't want to have another 10. We don't want Cologne to turn to Mariupol. We don't want to have it. We need to discuss. We need to give Putin something. It's better to give Ukraine, because Ukraine is not yours. It's always good to trade what is not yours.
Precisely.
But what I also wanted to ask you here, we have seen that this rhetoric of Chancellor Scholz starts to loosen support among the opposition, not opposition, I'm sorry, among his also coalition, his own coalition, the Greens and the Liberals. They are more and more allow more and more critical tones against Scholz. And he gets support also on social networks by the leaders of the far-right party Alternative for Germany and the far-left bloc of Sarah Wagenknecht.
Yeah.
And that looks scary when you are a chancellor who gets applause from the far-right and far-left wings. And what is your policy? How can it be how can it transform the German political landscape?
I mean, that's certainly a question, I think, for Olaf Scholz and not me. I mean, it beats me. I mean, that's just inexplicable how you can, realize that the other democratic parties of Germany are absolutely against you, and the only ones that seem to be supporting your policy are the fringe elements. I don't know how you are a chancellor who, thinks that he's doing his job correctly if that happens. But there's one thing I wanted to say about something that you just said, because I really want to emphasize this point. It's very important. When we hear especially social democrat rhetoric or German rhetoric in general about freezing the conflict, as you've said, it's always easier to give something that isn't yours to give, right? And so we give them Ukraine because, it's not us, or why not, that sort of thing. And this point is really important because it is so rare to see any discussion of what the Ukrainians themselves want in German debate about exactly this. We seem to pretend as if this is a decision that we can somehow make for the Ukrainians. And regularly, even when you see this discussed on German talk shows, and certainly when you see people like Mr. Mützenich make that horrible speech before the Bundestag yesterday, nowhere in there is there any discussion about what the Ukrainians themselves actually want. And this really needs to change in the German debate, for sure.
Absolutely, and that is why we ask you to send your donations. You can find the donation links in the description to this video, to this live stream. You can see the donation link and donation QR code on your screen now. We are in constant contact with the Ukrainian units. We ask them what they need, and we deliver it to them because it is what they need. It's not what we believe they need most, or they have to need or accept. And now we have another part of our program, and in particular, it is a speech of U.S. President Joe Biden, who has delivered to the nation recently. And I ask the studio to show it to you, because I think that there can be some interesting details we need to discuss.
Madam Vice President, members of Congress, my fellow Americans, in January 1941, Franklin Roosevelt came to this chamber to speak to the nation, and he said, "I address you at a moment unprecedented in the history of the Union. Hitler was on the march. War was raging in Europe. President Roosevelt's purpose was to wake up Congress and alert the American people that this was no ordinary time. Freedom and democracy were under assault in the world. Tonight, I come to this same chamber to address the nation. Now, it's we who face an unprecedented moment in the history of the Union. And yes, my purpose tonight is to wake up the Congress and alert the American people that this is no ordinary moment either. Not since President Lincoln and the Civil War have freedom and democracy been under assault at home as they are today. What makes our moment rare is that freedom and democracy are under attack both at home and overseas at the very same time. Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. But Ukraine can stop Putin. Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons that it needs to defend itself.
So you have seen that speech that U.S. President Joe Biden has given a couple of days ago. as addressed to the nation. And he was very hawkish, and it was the very beginning of his speech. It was not something that he said at the end. It was the first address, the first idea he wanted to deliver to the audience. And he was clearly pointing out that Putin wants to win this war and destroy Ukraine, and only Ukraine, if Ukraine wins that war, can guarantee security and stability in Europe. How much does it talk about Biden's real politics? His rhetoric has been strong all the time, but the US doesn't sell shells since weeks and months. Republicans say to block it, but President Biden sits on a special fund of $6 billion, which he can give to Ukraine just by his signature, and it doesn't happen. Is Biden, in fact, the same person, more or less, as Scholz, thinking that escalation management is what needed for this war, but delivering Ukraine the arms Ukraine needs to defeat Russia would make the situation worse?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a big variable that we're seeing. If we think of throughout this entire war, Washington and Berlin have been in quite a bit of alignment on exactly these kinds of questions, managing escalation, those sorts of things. And they've had an assessment of the risk of escalation that has absolutely just not served us very well in this conflict at all. It's not serving our security very well. We did see a Washington that did eventually sort of reluctantly agree to send Abrams tanks in order to sort of free up the Leopards. And as I said before in the show, I don't know that we are necessarily going to see Taurus cruise missile systems get sent from Germany to Ukraine unless we see ATACMS that come from the US. Scholz very much when he says "keine Alleingänge," we don't go it alone, he doesn't actually mean we don't go it alone. He means we don't go it alone without the U.S. I mean, Olaf Scholz could have gone ahead with certain deliveries when the French and the Brits did, for example. When they delivered Storm Shadow missiles, Olaf Scholz could have said, okay, I've got some allies here that are already delivering some missiles. I can basically use this as cover. He's waiting for the US, and Biden so far is not delivering all of the weaponry that he possibly could. And as you said, there is that special fund that is there. Now, it is not nearly as large as the amount of money that is currently tied up in U.S. Congress that Republicans are tying up, that could actually be a major difference to Ukraine. So we do have to note that U.S. Congress does have a responsibility to act here, that it doesn't all come down to Biden. But as strong as Biden's rhetoric is, and it's impressive, it does need to be backed up by proper action. And the only action here, I think, that's acceptable is that we do absolutely everything possible to help Ukraine win this conflict. And the only way to do that is to send everything we possibly can send. And that would include long-range cruise missiles from the US as well as in Germany. And I think that if we were to see the US move on this question, that would be maybe the one thing that could get, for example, Chancellor Olaf Scholz to move.
Indeed, and we have also a function of comments under both videos on the European Resilience Initiative Center live stream and on Silicon Curtain live stream. Feel free to ask your questions, to leave your comments, and we will try to address as many comments and questions as we can. I already see a comment by Leonard Schneider from Germany, and that is actually the example for me of this distance between the position of the Germans and the position of the Chancellorship, because he writes, well, I remember Andrei Melnik, he was not happy with the German politicians and demanded public support for Ukraine in Germany, and I could understand why Melnik so aggressively, urgently demanded help. And indeed, Ambassador Melnik, who I value a lot, he was very undiplomatic. But the reason was that it was the only way to get help. Otherwise, it would end in endless commissions and would end into nothing. And that is exactly what we observe now. And I want to return to my question. What kind of pressure can be done? Is there any country which could lead now in Europe or in the West to support Ukraine? We have seen South Korea, we have seen Japan, we now see France. We have the United Kingdom, which is supportive. But is it enough to lead the coalition of the good nations?
Well, I think it depends on the issue that you're talking about. First of all, I think that if France and the UK want to lead this coalition, they do have to put up more. We saw a very, very, very impressive start at the beginning of this conflict, especially by the United Kingdom, at delivering the kinds of weapons that Ukraine needed even before Putin invaded. And I mean, thank God they did, because we don't know what the situation would have necessarily been like had they not done so. This was at the same time, as I said before, that 75% of Germans were against delivering any weapons at all, and the German government was very much of that line that, you know, never again from Germany war, we'll send 5,000 helmets instead, at a time when the
that
UK...
was the advertising before the election in 2021, the advertising of the Green Party, no weapons deliveries to crisis areas. They have had to change completely their stance to that problem.
But I think that the UK showed impressive leadership at the beginning. We've seen that really peter out. Whether France under Macron right now is serious, he is of course in Berlin today meeting with both Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, and Olaf Scholz, would require him, I think, to put a lot more money and skin in the game than France has done currently. It's contributed way below its capacity. So that really is the big question. Could Germany lead? I mean, perhaps under different leadership it could. If Germany wanted to lead, it could. The question is one of political will. It certainly has the capacity. And I think that's part of the tragic bit of this entire thing, is that all of Germany's allies know, and Ukraine knows, what a fully committed Germany would actually mean and be able to achieve. So that's a big question. We do, I think, still need to see some leadership, U.S. leadership. We do need to see Biden step up with more deliveries of the very key weapons, including ATACMS, to really claim the leadership position. And I'll say one last thing very briefly, because I know that later on in the show we're going to be talking a bit more about this particular topic. My home country, where I come from, Canada, right now has an opportunity to lead on one particular file. It does not have the capacity, particularly militarily, to send the kinds of kit that would make a real difference. But it does have the opportunity to lead on legislation to seize Russian state assets, central bank reserves that were frozen at the beginning of the war that the Russians cannot currently touch, but they're not doing anything. It could help get things going, help seize these assets, give them to the Ukrainians, either for liberation, so purchasing of weapons, or for ongoing reconstruction, which we know is needed. Canada right now is one of only 2 countries, and it's the only one in the G7 that actually has draft legislation allowing for this, and we see that there's big hesitation in places like France and Germany to commit to this kind of action. And right now, I'm writing an article that's coming out in a couple of days about this. Right now, Canada just seems to want to follow along. It wants to wait for the rest of its G7 partners before it actually uses this law, and I think that's wrong-headed in my view. I think that Canada has a chance to lead and say, we're going to do this, and we're going to shame the rest of you into following along because we have this law, we're in front, we're going to go ahead. And I think that that's the kind of attitude that we need to see from everybody, whether it's on weapons in general, whether it's on leading in the conflict in general, whether it's on one specific file like seizing Russian assets. We need to see, I think, more of this attitude of taking initiative, being bold, and going ahead, and sometimes making others follow us.
Indeed, there is a huge demand for the leadership. We see it since the start of the full-scale invasion. We remember how the Poles said to the Germans, which was absolutely unexpected, send the tanks, send the tanks.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians said, yeah, we are ready to accept German leadership in the military domain, which the Germans said, oh, no, please, we don't want to be war leaders. It's not what... And the whole Central Europe countries They said, we want Germany to be that, but Germany spoiled the chance, obviously. Now there is a need, either France, or or Canada, the United States, stay in front of a huge challenge. November this year will be the elections, and who knows how the outcome would be. We have now a guest who is about to join us live in the studio. It is Yevgheniya Gaber, who is a professor at George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, and she's joining us live from Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Hello, Yevgheniya.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having arrived to this show. And you have probably heard what we discussed before: the question of leadership, the question of which weapons can be delivered, should be delivered, will be delivered. What is the role of the United States? What is the role of international institutions here in this war? The whole support for Ukraine military character is more or less bilateral with certain countries. What is the role of institutions like NATO?
Well, the role of institutions, as well as in the case of the national governments, it's all about the leadership, which you mentioned. And I think this is really important to understand, that we need to change the patterns of our behavior. So in many cases, including with NATO, of course, we have a certain level of support. Of course, we have very important statements by the Secretary General. But on the other hand, I still don't see this urgency. I still don't see very often this feeling that timing matters. Because as we are speaking now and as we are discussing these matters, I keep getting notifications from the hometown, Odessa, about another attack, Russian attack on the residential areas. And this is how the Ukrainians are living these days, now for the third year, actually. So the role of the institutions, I think, in the current setting, in the current environment, has to be reviewed. Because if we speak broadly, not only about NATO, but about the United Nations, for example, about the Red Cross, about many other institutions, we still see this reluctance to take a leadership, to take some active steps, proper steps. And this is something about this cognitive Zeitenwende, mental Zeitenwende, that we are lacking in the discussion. Though, of course, Ukraine appreciates the support that it has been getting from NATO and other institutions, including the European Union, by the way, and the peace facility, which is used by the EU.
Have the presidential elections this year in the United States, and we don't know what will be the outcome. What can be the consequence if someone like Donald Trump enters the White House? How are the European nations ready to deliver what the US will obviously not be ready to deliver?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the changes in Europe that we've seen recently, including efforts to step up military production, including new initiatives, these are all steps taken to become more self-sufficient in case President Trump wins these elections. I don't believe in catastrophic scenarios, because I still trust in the institutions in the United States. But it's not about the US withdrawing from NATO, for example. The whole rhetoric about the possibility of withdrawing from NATO, that undermines trust, that undermines credibility. And this is exactly what Putin wants, because one of the main goals in this war, not only on Ukraine, as we fairly mentioned, but Russia's war on the West, is to actually break this unit and undermine this credibility of the political West as a credible partner. So, of course, all these conversations about Putin shall feel free to attack any country which is not delivering to the 2% of their GDP to defense, and then the possibility of the US decreasing role in NATO, and then some kind of illusion about the possibility to end this war in 1 day or in 2 days, unless Russians withdraw their troops from the territory of Ukraine unilaterally. That all does not help to build this unit and to build this trust. So if there is a silver lining in the whole situation, I think this is a chance for Europe to actually step in and say, we can and we will defend ourselves no matter what. We do not want to depend on the situation in Washington, D.C., as it has been the case so far. And it's not about any kind of strategic competition or strategic autonomy seen as decoupling of Europe from the US. It's rather about the burden sharing, and it's rather about actually living up to the expectations of contributing to the European defense. So here, as you mentioned, the role of the Central European countries, of the Nordic Baltic countries, is also crucial, because these are the leaders in pushing for more, in bringing this sense of Zeitenwende and urgency to the European debate. But still, at this point of time, I cannot say that Europe is ready to act with this resolve, unilaterally, not looking back at DC. Be it ATACMS and Taurus, which has been mentioned today, or even debate on Ukraine's membership in NATO, because we are now ahead of the Washington summit. And speaking about the role of institutions, I still do not see a political will or leadership, neither in Berlin nor in DC, to at least extend invitation to Ukraine, not to mention, of course, the membership itself, because all of this is still about looking who will take the lead so that the others would follow.
And while you are providing us with this insight, we are receiving comments on our both YouTube channels, European Resilience Initiative Center and Silicon Curtain. And a lot of people agree with you. They write, it is not about who will lead, just step up and take a lead, just act. Or the others write that the leaders in the West do not understand the urgency of this situation and like sleepwalking into this delusional reluctancy and don't want to do what is needed. So a lot of comments who support your point of view. That when we look at the EU and NATO in Europe, we also see the countries which looked like weak parts of the chain. Hungary, now Slovakia. From certain perspective, surprisingly, the blockades from some, not the Polish state, of course, but some actors in Poland who block the grain deliveries from Russia, from Ukraine, of course, but do not block grain deliveries from Russia via Belarus. This all undermines the unity and creates additional tensions in our response. How dangerous is this situation? Can it get worse? Or have we reached now the bottom line?
Well, the problem is that we are now in this super election year, and this does not help at all to Ukraine, because in most cases, Ukraine is a hostage of the domestic politics in many countries. The second issue is Russian operations of influence, Russians agents of influence who are all over Europe in different domains, starting from academia, think tanks, universities, and go into the political parties, members of parliament, even intelligence services, as we can now see. And I believe you will have another panel on that today. So I would really recommend to those who want to listen to that. Because this is also about how the perception is created that Poland is not supporting Ukraine, for example, because there is this blockade on the border. And then when you look, when you dig deeper into the situation, and when you look how those farmers who are protesting on the borders are actually affiliated or connected to the Russian partners and sponsors, that can shed a bit of light to this whole situation. It's not limited to that. It's also part of the domestic politics in Poland and relations between Warsaw and Brussels, for sure. But then there is also this dimension of Russian operations of influence and reflexive control. When we want it or not, we have to react to what is happening rather than be proactive in setting the stage and shaping the whole debate and discussion. So I don't think that we are in a dire situation there. I think that Ukraine still feels this support from the European and the Western partners in the United States. But again, because there are elections not only on the national level, but also to the European Parliament. And we now see how Russia is stepping up its efforts to actually drag its either pro-Russian or Russian-sponsored or Russian-bribed candidates sometimes to rather high levels, I think this is the threat, because we will be facing a totally different environment, a totally different setting by the end of this year. And this is the threat that I see, because I do believe that the level of support is still high in many European countries. But on the other hand, I think that the threat perception is not adequate. And there is this gap between the situation on the ground in Ukraine and in many European countries, which are quite far from the front line. Yesterday in Germany, there was this alert just to see whether the system or emergency system is working. And I saw the reaction of many friends here in Germany, how they were feeling uncomfortable, to say the least, if not panicking, those who did not know about that before. In Ukraine, people hear these kind of air raid alerts, which are not for the purpose of training, but for the purpose of saving their lives and going to shelters when you are under attack of the Russian missiles every single day, 5 times, 6 times sometimes. It's more than 1,000 air raid alerts by now. So this threat perception in such countries, maybe as Hungary or that you mentioned, or some countries which are far from the front line, it also does not let us tap into the potential of this defense cooperation and actually going all in to support Ukraine, not only as long as it takes, but also to deliver whatever it takes to ensure Ukraine's victory. So briefly, like to wrap up this long answer, probably if I see this threat to undermine the unity of the European Union from inside, yes, I do see it. But I also think that this is a good chance for the European Union to review its internal procedures, voting procedures, from going from unanimity to maybe a qualified majority on some issues, to talk about the defense union within the European Union that would actually allow to be more consistent and coherent in defense policies. So this is also a time of opportunities to have a real Zeitenwende, not only for separate countries, but also for the institutions like NATO and the EU as well.
Here you have mentioned the sign of hope that not all countries are being used by Russia as their agents or assets, but we have also leadership within the European Union and NATO, and I would like to name the Czech leader, General Pavel, who has led the action to find enough ammunition for the Ukrainian army. And he found the 800,000 shells or even more, and now he's looking for funds, and I think that some funds are being guaranteed. And combined with the Estonian initiative of creating a joint shells production for the European Union, which was not that successful until now, but we have hopes that the production capacities will be expanded until the end of this year. Do you see some hope in leadership of these countries who have much more experience with the Russian threats?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the point that I was making before, that it's about the leadership, it's about particular personalities who can take this lead, but that's also about the threat perception and experience of living either close to Russia or under the Russian occupation. Because such countries as Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Czech Republic, they are the countries most exposed to the Russian threat and Russian influence for years, for decades. And I remember even after the occupation of parts of Georgia back in 2008 by Russia, when voices from these countries, including from Ukraine, but also from the Baltic states, were raised and saying that, hey, this is a threat we have to face. There is no time for self-deterrence. There is no time for de-escalation by not reacting. If we want to de-escalate and prevent further aggression, we have to react in a very strong way. These countries or certain experts or political leaders were seen as paranoics who are just afraid of Russia and who have the psychological trauma from the past. And this is not something possible in the 21st century. And now we actually see how these countries are at the front line of deterring Russia, also defending the rest of Europe from the Russian aggression. So indeed, it's just because we have knowledge of Russia, we know how it is to live with Russia here in the region, which brings us to the conclusion that there is no way we can negotiate with Russia when it has an upper hand on the battlefield and when we feel ourselves deterred by Russia. If we want to de-escalate, then we need to be strong. And this unity and strong reaction and being proactive rather than on defense and rather than reactive to Russian acts of aggression, this is what would be the most de-escalatory policy in the region. So I do believe that these countries in the Central and Eastern Europe, they are both morally leading the whole discussion, but also bringing very important sense of urgency and presence of this threat, not only to Ukraine, but to the rest of Europe as well, should Ukraine fail.
Leadership has been produced, like if this leadership is available, if this leadership is on the table, do the European countries have enough technological expertise and capacities to produce, let me say, enough shells, enough tanks, enough other types of ammunition and equipment?
Well, that's exactly what we're seeing now, how slowly but gradually, but in a coherent way, we see new initiatives to step up military production. One of the best examples probably would be the Rheinmetall, which builds new ammunition plants now. We are discussing also joint production in Ukraine, though it's not easy during the war. We need additional air defense to defend those facilities. But that is exactly the debate we should have been witnessing for 2 years now, at least. It's a bit belated, but still it's a positive sign that Europe is trying also to step up military production and come up with these new initiatives to increase its own capacities, because it's not there now. As has been mentioned today several times, there have been these decades of peace in Europe. And this, of course, influences not only the perception and mentality, but also the situation on the ground with the production of ammos. And now we're back to the beginning of the 20th century, probably, in terms of this threat. And artillery still matters. This is not a war only of drones and cutting-edge technologies, which are an important part of this war, but that's also about basic things like artillery shells, which we lack in Europe and which we lack in Ukraine, of course. So we are not yet there where we want to be, but I think that the positive dynamics in this domain is definitely there.
Thank you. It was an amazing, full of insights comment by Professor Yevgheniya Gaber, who teaches at makes her research at the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And thank you for having joined us today. And we are coming back to our live broadcasting with Aaron Burnett, who is a security analyst and expert Canadian living in Berlin, a co-host of a podcast Berlin Side Out, yes, which he runs together with Dr. Benjamin Tallis from the DGAP, German Council on Foreign Relations. And what Professor Gaber has said, that there is not enough political will, but there are like technological competence. And I need to add, there is economy for that. Like we have a GDP many times larger than Russia. If we have invested a slightly piece of this GDP in defense, we would have already won. Can we still hope that this reluctancy and this denial that this war is not something that happens to others, that it can be overcome? We had Bucha, eyes opening moment. Mm-hmm. We had Mariupol, eyes opening moment. Yes. But now, like many people say, just, okay, let's just forget it because we're too tired of that.
I think, well, first of all, on the subject of Ukraine fatigue, which is a term that has been used in Germany lately, I'd like to be very careful about using it, simply because I think that I remember this one tweet, for example, by the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, who did a fast motion video of the line to get into Cafe Kyiv a few weeks ago, and how it was a 1 to 2 hour wait to get in. I mean, you know, and then he said, yes, the famous Ukraine fatigue, this sort of thing.
We have been there at the Cafe Kyiv with our Crimea panel, and it started after 9 p.m. and we had full house. We had full house. People were staying in the L, and I thought, okay, if we have at 9 p.m. that Crimea liberation panel, then what kind of Ukraine fatigue we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think we have to be a little bit careful with using Ukraine fatigue, because I think that there are some vested interests in perpetuating this kind of fatigue. You know, and certainly there are political leaders who are very keen to get back to their domestic agendas, who have things that they want to focus on. And I mean, but this is the function of effective government. You should be able to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. You know, you should be able to handle these security issues, and you should also be able to handle domestic issues at the same time. And indeed, it is very necessary that happens. You know, Ben and I, my co-host, of course, Ben Tallis, who we mentioned, who sadly could not be with us today, but we talk about this in relation to neo-idealism, of which Ukraine is absolutely the shining light of at the moment. It is, you know, a democracy which has been attacked, which has decided it's going to defend itself. You know, but part of that, part of defending democracy is also making sure your society remains worth defending. And so it is important for us to be able to handle security and domestic issues at the exact same time. But it does require us to have really frank discussions with the public. And that is a discussion that some, I think, you know, members of the German political elite are willing to have and have started having, but we're certainly not seeing that from Chancellor Olaf Scholz, for example. I think that you know, Ukraine is obviously a problem that they see it as a problem.
A problem caused by Ukraine in their eyes, not by Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Yeah. I mean, you know, why doesn't Ukraine just, you know, stop defending itself and then it will all go away? This is literally logic that we see, which is of course ridiculous. But you know, nevertheless, this is something that we see that I think is motivating some of their decisions. The reality is that it won't go away, and we can't go back to business as usual. Although I do think that there is a sizable section of Western political elites who somehow think that's possible. We are always going to have to spend more on defense than we have been, because of course the U.S. security guarantee is in question. We cannot. Even if Trump loses this election, Trumpism isn't necessarily going to die. We do see a Republican Party that is less invested in European security in general, and that isn't going to go away just because Trump goes away, for example. We can't, you know, sort of cross our fingers and hope that the Democrats win the White House for the next 20 years. That is not viable. So we do have to step up. We have to have the necessary economic and industrial policy production to put our economy on a war footing if necessary. And by the way, I want to get back to your point about GDP, because this is something we can do. You know, if we get into the whole subject of narratives, we bought into this narrative of Russia being somehow this, I mean, yes, it has nuclear weapons, we know that, but of being somehow this, you know, huge, you know, strong enemy. And of course, we have to take it seriously. It is, its economy is on a war footing, and because it's an authoritarian state, it can put its entire economy on a war footing and not really be overly concerned about the welfare of its people. But that all said, Canada has a larger economy than Russia, for example. You know, and that's just, and that's a relatively small economy compared to the UK or France or Germany or the US or Japan, all of which are larger. Italy has a larger economy than Russia. So if we want to put our economy on the necessary footing to ensure our own defense, we absolutely can. It just takes will.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly come back now to the question of economy. But before we do this, don't forget to go into the description of this live video. First of all, you will see the time schedule and can plan your time, what panels you want definitely to attend. You don't want to miss them, and believe me, there will be stellar guests there. And also you can find links for donation for the Ukrainian army. You can also see the link on your screen with the QR code and with the donation link. And if you donate, your money will go directly to support of Ukrainian units, and we will buy them the equipment they need. They told us to buy them, and we are in contact with them since over a year, regularly delivering them things which can save lives and which are saving lives. Thank you to your donations. But we have this discussion on how can we creatively approach to the challenge of defeating Russia and protecting not only Ukraine, but us all, because Russia, with all their threats, threatens us all. And we have already discussed the question of confiscation of Russian sovereign assets.
Yeah.
We have for that a video which we have recorded before this interview, before this live, and I want to introduce you this video we have recorded with Olena Halushka, who is a co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory.
So we are actually talking about the reserves of the Russian Central Bank. In total, their reserves before the beginning of the full-scale war were around almost $600 billion. A little less than half of this money were held in G7 countries and other democracies like Australia, for example, and or Switzerland. And around $300 billion assets were frozen in those G7 countries. These are actually bonds, securities, and cash that are held either in depositories or in banks or other financial institutions of the Western countries. Most of this money, around $200 billion, are held in one depository, Belgian agency Euroclear. And that's why we are currently advocating for the establishment of G7 plus Belgium confiscation coalition, because G7 decision would be a very important political step, and Belgian participation would have a very practical implication, because that's the country where most of this money is currently held and where it has to be confiscated from. Currently, there are actually two tracks of discussion. One is within G7, and there they try to discuss full confiscation. We have how the debates are going on there. We have the US, Canada, and UK that are in favor of full confiscation, and we have European part of G7 countries, France, Germany, and Italy, and Japan, who are more cautious with regards to how this has to be done. Simultaneously, we have parallel track, which is European Union, and it is focused on the windfall profits. They passed the decision in February to put aside on a separate account all windfall profits. By windfall profits, I mean actually interests on the frozen assets. Why they are called windfall? Because they would never appear if there was no Russian full-scale aggression and if there were no sanctions related to the Russian full-scale aggression, meaning that this money in the normal circumstances would not be generated. So there is the decision of the European Council that those windfall profits would be put on a separate account from 2024 and further on. We are talking about 4 up to 5 maximum billion euros per year. So it's not that this money, would be seriously life-saving, but it's much better, of course, to have them than not to have. And here it is also very important to mention that to get this money finally sent to Ukraine, European Union has to make additional decision that this money would not only be set apart, but actually transferred to Ukraine. Why this decision wasn't made kind of together with the previous one, I have no idea, because for me it goes without saying. If you put the profits on the frozen money aside, of course, those profits need to be transferred to Ukraine. But very important thing that it regards only the profits from 2024 and further. And we still have profits for 2022 and 2023. And here we speak about a little bit more than 5 billion euro. So in the light of Ukraine desperately needing money already today, this money is kept by Euroclear, this Belgian depository, with the decision of the Belgian government as the reserve for some hypothetical future risks. And we are talking to Belgian authorities, we are talking to the governance, to the Euro Commission, to the European Council, EU member states, that why should 5 billion euros stay within Belgian Euroclear when Ukrainians are dying already now? Just 2 days ago, Russia killed 12 people in Odessa, including 5 kids, including, 2 babies, 1 toddler, and 2 a bit older kids. I mean, Ukraine desperately needs every dollar and every euro already today. And we have this 5 billion euro, which will stay with Belgium for some hypothetical risks. What if Russia goes to courts? What if Russia attacks, does some cyber attacks against Euroclear, whatever else? But they do not say, what are their risk assessment? And, lawyers for 5 billion euro, I mean, you can basically hire all of the lawyers of this planet. And if we speak about the trials, Euroclear is very scared of trials in Russia. But, the court, Russia is not about rule of law. Russia is not about trials. Russian courts are about issuing the rulings of whatever Kremlin wants them to rule, meaning that what is the point of spending money on the trials in Russia if the decision would anyway be whatever Kremlin wants? So this sounds ridiculous from our perspective, and we will continue demanding that this 5 billion euros windfall profits made for 2022 and 2023 should be sent to Ukraine as soon as possible to protect Ukrainians. Well, maybe some part of this money should indeed stay with Belgium, that's true, but definitely not 5 billion. So there are basically 3 main blocks of arguments against confiscation. First one is legal. As you've said, that there were no precedents before, that this money is protected by the sovereign immunity, so we cannot simply take them from Russia and transfer to Ukraine. The second big block is financial arguments and the trust in dollar and euro as the reserve currencies, and that after confiscation is done, the reserves of the third countries will simply flock away from the Western financial system and undermine them. And the third important pillar is so-called retaliation fears, that Russia is blackmailing that they will start confiscating Western businesses or their assets that are located in Russia. From the legal perspective, there's absolutely no difference between the freezing and the confiscation. And if we speak about the legal arguments, international lawyers prove that the confiscation can be done as the countermeasure. Countermeasure, that's the actions of either the victims or the third parties who are also felt some damages from the illegal activities of an aggressor that are aimed at motivating the aggressor to stop their illegal actions and violations of the international law. So this freezing of the $300 billion in the first days of the full-scale war, it was countermeasure back then. And it was a relatively proportionate countermeasure because Russia hasn't inflicted very high losses back then like they are having now. According to the latest assessment of the World Bank, the damages of the 2 years of the full-scale war, and we are talking only about the full-scale war. We are not talking about the 10 years of the Russian aggression since 2014. So 2 years of the full-scale war inflicted at Ukraine $486 billion damages, meaning that it's absolutely logical when everybody is demanding that the countermeasure should be toughened. And the next step after freezing, of course, would be to confiscate this money and send it to Ukraine. You're also absolutely right that the message and the signal for the third countries was already sent 2 years ago. And those who wished to get their assets and transfer them into other more safe places, they had plenty of time to do this. But the problem, which is very often not said, explained, discussed by the opponents of the confiscation, is that in case if confiscation is done by G7 countries and European Union jointly, there are simply not many destinations for the assets to flock away, because Chinese yuan is not a sufficient reserve currency, because it is not fully convertible, plus Chinese investment market is actually not safe. They have plenty of cases of interference of the government in the investment markets. Where else can these assets go? Into Indian rupee. I mean, it's not convertible also. Into some Middle East currencies, well, they do not have, the capacity to absorb as much of the assets, plus they also have this convertibility issues. Somebody speaks about the potential currency of BRICS Union. But do you really think that, let's say, China and India can come up with one joint currency when they are having very different geopolitical goals? Of course, no. So in case if the confiscation is done jointly, there is simply not many options at all for the currencies to flock away, meaning that the fears are very often largely overinflated.
Welcome back to our live broadcasting from Berlin, a TV marathon today, 8 hours long in support for Ukraine. Don't forget to send your donations to support the Ukrainian army. You can see the link for the donation in the description of this live video, and also on your screen now you see the QR code and the donation link. We will send the goods we buy for the Ukrainian army directly to the units, or personally bring them to the front, which we normally do. And we are talking today with Burnett, who is a security expert living in Berlin, a Canadian person, also co-host of a podcast, Berlin Side Out, which he runs together with Dr. Benjamin Tallis from the DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations. Benjamin is unfortunately not with us today. What do you think about the feasibility of confiscating of Russian sovereign assets?
It's not simply feasible, it's necessary, in my view. So we can do this, we absolutely are able to do this, and we absolutely should. I mean, the title of this event today is War on All Fronts, and we have to remember that this means that every possible measure that we can take to help ensure Ukrainian victory, we have to take. There is, of course, military dimensions to that. There's political and diplomatic dimensions, but there are financial dimensions. And that's part of why we're even having this, is also the financial dimension, helping to raise the money to get the things that Ukraine needs. So, of course, and I encourage you to donate as well. Remember the links that Sergej has provided for you there. But when it comes to the financial aspect of this war, there is a financial aspect of this war, and this is absolutely part of it. I mean, these assets have been sitting on the sidelines for 2 years, and originally we saw that the freezing of Russian central bank assets, which is held in Western bank accounts, was absolutely an extremely effective measure at the beginning of the war. I mean, the ruble was absolutely hammered over a period of a couple of days, and it seems as if this is something that Putin and the Russian regime was not actually expecting, that the West really would take this step and help to paralyze Russia's ability to be able to wage this war. But that period is long past, and it's time to actually confiscate these, give them to Ukraine. And there's two various ways, of course, that those confiscated assets could be used. Number one is, of course, for reconstructing Ukraine. That is certainly something that has to not simply be done at the end, but ongoing. I mean, infrastructure is constantly being bombed in Ukraine and must constantly be repaired. So that is an ongoing cost. I mean, when we say reconstruction, people often think that that's something that happens at the beginning of the war, but this is something that is consistently happening, which is one of the reasons that these assets need to be confiscated now to help alleviate some of those financial pressures. But also they could be used for Ukrainian liberation, which is to help Ukraine to buy equipment, to buy weapons, to buy the things that it actually needs to be able to win this war. Feasibility is a tricky question. The reality is most countries do not yet have the legislation in place to seize these assets. But this is a technical issue. And this is a technical issue that, as with all technical issues, can be solved if there is simply the political will to do so. My home country is demonstrating legislative leadership on that, as I said earlier in the show. There is a Canadian law that is going through that allows for this. Originally, Canada was one of the first countries to pass a law allowing for the confiscation of private assets. These are assets that are held by Russian oligarchs in Western countries like Canada. Canada, for example, seized a plane. It seized assets, I think 26 million, that was sitting in a holding company believed to be owned by Roman Abramovich, for example. But that pales in comparison, for example, to state assets. In Canada alone, there are an estimated $19 billion Canadian of Russian central bank state assets that are sitting either in Canadian accounts or in accounts associated with Euroclear, which Canada has can claim the legal right to seize. When, as Olena was saying there, the amount of assets are vast, over 300 billion US. Most of those, by the way, are located in Europe. So over 200 billion of that, over two-thirds.
As we talked at the interview with Olena, she said before this live, she said that they, like a huge line port, are in Belgium. Mm-hmm. Like you can just like take them and use them, or like at least you can use the income which is being generated by the availability of these assets. So you just like need to have political will to do it, and there are, as you mentioned, the fears that it is like illegal according to international law because it violates Russia's right. We have a war, we have genocide in Europe. Of course you need to violate someone's rights, like property rights of the Russian army on their tanks, or property rights of Russian oil companies on their refineries which are being hit by the Ukrainian army. But to avoid your property being damaged, don't start the wars. Yeah.
Well, and this is precisely it. I mean, we have, there are still some people who are skeptical about seizing Russian assets, partly because they think that it would violate international law. As Olena's Foundation has been center has been arguing, no, this is in accordance with international law, because we are exercising enforcement or countermeasure of a obligation under international law that Russia has, which is to not invade your neighbors and not, perpetrate mass killing of them, which obviously is, I think, the more important principle of international law. But this is absolutely within international law as I see it, and there are legal scholars that are making this exact same argument, that it is feasible under international law, because the original question was on feasibility. Under domestic law, we also hear legal arguments that it is feasible under domestic law because Russia does not enjoy as a state the kinds of protections that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the German Grundgesetz would offer. For example, as a state, it doesn't enjoy those. In terms of feasibility, Canada is proving, and actually Switzerland recently, of all places, is proving that it is legally feasible. We can pass these laws. It can be technically challenging because under domestic law in many countries, there is the states themselves are enjoy exception or immunity under currently existing sanctions law to have their assets seized. But with some political will, you can change that. And that's precisely what we are already seeing in my own home country, in Switzerland. And that's precisely what we need to be seeing in more countries. We need a shift of thinking on this.
We have, while we are talking now, we have some comments which our audience posts under the video. And I encourage you to ask your questions and leave your comments under the video or share this video to encourage other people to do this. We have 3 comments which I in particular find very interesting. First one, there could be, no matter what you took from Russia and gave to Ukraine, you will never compensate anything what Ukraine has suffered, like a bit of that. No. Because the damage is vast. Like, it is not only hundreds of billions of euros, it's human lives, it's tragedy, it's stolen years and years, ages of human life combined. I totally agree here. But here we have like 2 other questions. One thing is the role of businesses, and the businesses seem to be unhappy with what is going. And another question is, didn't Putin just sign off that leased airlines in Russia as theirs? So there is a fear that if we confiscate Russia's sovereign assets, Russia confiscates property of our companies. How much of I
am honestly so sick of these arguments, because Russia will do whatever it wants. It's already demonstrating that, right? Fear of saying that you're not going to do something because you fear Russian retaliation. They never pay attention to this. I mean, we're talking about this with Taurus, for example, where, let's not send Taurus. Well, that's not going to prevent them from getting Iranian-made cruise missiles of their own. They don't care. And in fact, they're like, oh, great. You won't send missiles, we'll send of our own. We have battlefield advantage. Russia is already retaliating against Russian Western companies.
I read this comment today in a discussion about the destiny of a Russian House representation office of Russia, a propaganda agency here in Berlin. Don't confiscate it, because if you do it, Russia will confiscate property of Goethe Institute, a cultural institute in Moscow. So I don't care, okay, they will confiscate the property. First, I'm not sure that Goethe Institute owns any property, but even if they do, you will not be able to teach Russians German language. What a huge loss, but you will undercut the Russian propaganda in the heart of our city, where they sell all their books and held all the speeches, etc. So if we think about confiscating, can several countries, without waiting for international community to do it, can the Netherlands or Canada say, okay, we do it alone and we lead?
And actually, I think that I make an argument in an article that I actually have coming out in a couple of days that is precisely what my own home country, Canada, should do. That it should not wait, that it shouldn't wait for G7 agreement. It has the necessary legislative framework in place. It needs to set an example, and it needs to go ahead. Because we often see, also on Ukraine, is that when countries do that, other people do follow. It does build a certain amount of consensus, and I think that is precisely what is necessary. It's just time to act. And especially because every single day that passes in Ukraine, as you say, is a time when we lose more precious human lives there. As you said, Ukraine has already lost far more than what we can compensate them for. Nevertheless, it's important that we do this, partly because Russia is never going to pay reparations. I mean, anyone who's expecting Russia to pay reparations after the war is over or anything like that.
Russia never pays voluntarily for what they have damaged. But we need to close this panel now, as the time is coming for us to go into a break. Don't switch off, or if you do this, then don't forget to enter into the panel again. And to look at the time schedule in the description in this video, we'll see again. But now look, the interviews were recorded extra for this panel.